Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I know I'm usually can't get through everything I have planned for today. So we're going to go through, hopefully, the early parts of the design process to talk about. And what I do want you to be thinking about either how this has been applied to your project already or how you're going to apply it. So these steps are really critical, the specification development. And so if you don't have a really clear understanding of what those specs are, either your team needs to go back and maybe refine those, but that really is the basis for what you should be doing on your project. So, all right. Course deliverables for this week. So the individual evaluation rubric, except for senior design students, yours is the outcomes matrix. Every time I say individual evaluation rubric for senior design students, just equate that. Any questions about the individual evaluation rubric? So do you know where to find it? No, maybe. So it was in the course packet, but I recommend that you download the doc version of it, the docx or whatever, so that you can edit it and keep adding on. So I can show you where it is if oops. So I always go under current students. Here it can be under grading and guidelines or administration, or just go under grading. And then this is it right here. So you can open it and then have your own version of it that you can keep editing. Because the goal here is that you continue to revise this as the semester goes on. So you can fill out the things at the top, but you want to identify what you have learned or contributed to your project so far in the top part. And really the important thing too is where we can find evidence of it. So, and it needs to be specific. Don't say SharePoint or your notebook, because it's really hard to search all of SharePoint or all of your notebook to find evidence. So you want to be very specific. Or if you've written code, or if you have your project that you can actually point to, that can be your evidence as well. And then the other part then, whoops, I think I just want to. So you can check it out and then save a copy for you. The other thing then you want to do is indicate what your contribution and learning will be for the rest of the semester. So this is a great place where you can take your semester plan that your project is developing and actually then identify which tasks you're going to be responsible for within your project. So in lab, hopefully this week, your teams are taking a look, your TAs and your advisors are taking a look to make sure that you have your semester plan and that everything is covered by somebody's individual evaluation. Somebody has that on their roll. And that everybody has a role or a plan for what they're going to do for the project. Now we know these things kind of are living documents to some degree, but this will give you practice. I don't usually require that you have to do your self-grading at this point. At mid-semester, you'll need to evaluate yourself and then indicate which grade you believe that you have earned and where we can find evidence of that grade. So it doesn't fly to just say you think you've gotten an A+ just because you're awesome. It has to have some evidence, or just because that's the grade you want. But where's the evidence for being able to do that? Okay? At week 8, I would expect some of the things that you're going to have at week 4 in the future work will move up to things that you've accomplished, and then you'll still have a few things. And I know at this point it may be a little hard to be very specific, but at week 8 you should be pretty specific about what you have, what you're going to do the rest of the semester. Okay? Any questions? All right. And then semester plan. Webmasters, anyway, if we have any webmasters, we expect websites to be updated by the end of week 5. Okay, so should start working on that if you haven't already. So it really just is a summary of the projects and the team members. Okay, this isn't where you necessarily want to post all your design documentation. That goes on SharePoint. But we want external people to be able to come and look at your team and get a sense for the projects you're working on. Think of your audience as potential sponsors. So a lot of these corporate people that may be coming around or on campus this week, thinking about supporting EPICS, they want to see what's going on your teams. Also, potential future team members. You want to find out, what am I going to do if I'm going to be part of that team in EPICS? So those are your 2 primary audiences as you think about updating for this. Okay? All right. So hopefully you reflected in your notebook on the homework from last week. So if you either did from the wallet exercise or from the design process document, who wants to share what they have learned? And hopefully you have that in your notebook so you can just look down. You don't have to make this up right now. You can actually just share something that you've already written. Yes?
The wallet exercise taught me to focus and concentrate on the needs and expectations of the customer and not what I would want. And so I personally designed for myself, but I was actually designing for somebody else so they would use and implement their own life.
Yes.
So I was designing for their needs.
Okay. All right. And so Amy talked about how she was focused on the customer's needs. Was that a different, had you thought about design that way before?
No.
Okay.
Previous experience designing for anybody.
Okay. All right. Yes?
You have to keep an objective mind and plan for the future as well.
Okay. Objective mind, plan for the future as well. Yes?
There's a lot of back and forth in the design process. It's not just straightforward.
Exactly. Iteration. Back and forth, iterate, iterate, iterate. Absolutely. Anything else? Yes?
It's okay to try to convince the customer on your ideas.
It's okay to, yeah, it should be a conversation and you can actually, they may not anticipate what they need, but if you can show them a new idea and they can experience, they actually may, like that. I don't think, people weren't asking necessarily for the iPod when it first came out. You guys are kind of young to know that, but if people would have asked what you wanted, you wouldn't have said, I want this MP3 player that can actually, doesn't use a CD or any other kind of media like that or a tape. And so they anticipated the need and actually created a market related to that. So sometimes there's a solution that we may not even have imagined as a customer that actually really does a great job related to that. So anything different, for those of you who've had, and there was a number of you who had a prior design experience, is there anything different that stood out from either the wallet exercise or the design process? So who had previous design experience? Okay. How does this align? Is it the same or is it different? Yep.
Well, previously, all the design experience I've had, it's how to solve kind of an objective problem in the most efficient way.
Okay.
As opposed to how to solve somebody's problem that they actually continue to have opinions about how it might be done.
Absolutely. So it's really thinking often design even is thinking, given specs and you have to actually just solve it that way, as you said, very efficiently. I think it is important, especially in the context that we're in, where we're designing real things for real people, that we actually are thinking about things more broadly and meeting their needs instead of maybe just problem solving to a set of specifications. Okay, great. Anybody else have something different? Yes?
So I've noticed in my previous design experience, we didn't have as much time, so we had a 6-week, we had only 6 weeks, it was a competition, so we only had 6 weeks to finish what we were building. And then here, here, and we mostly just build. We didn't really write anything down.
Okay.
And so here it's almost all writing it down and then you build. So that's a lot different.
Yeah, so I mean, and I think I would challenge you to do a combination of both building and writing. I mean, because it's important that you make note of why you're doing what you're doing. And why do you think that's important? How many people are on a team on a continuing project that the documentation was not very good and they're having a little bit of trouble? Okay. Usually there's more. Hopefully we're doing better. It is important to capture those things because it's not just for us or getting it done for that competition. It has to exist beyond, and we have to be able to support our project partners. So part of it is, doing that. But I would really recommend that there's this action and reflection together. Kind of how you iterate, they should go back and forth between those. Okay. All right, so here's the design process. We're going to focus, hopefully we'll get through conceptual design today, but that may be a little ambitious. But talk about some of the steps and strategies you might use throughout this design process. So again, project identification, where the goal is to just make sure that we've identified an appropriate project. This is at a very high level that we do a needs assessment and or identify the stakeholders. This will be something that we will iterate and come back and actually refine later in the design. So one of the best questions to think about with a needs assessment is, what is the gap between their current solution or situation and what they want? And if you can identify that actually provides the opportunity and a potential project. And so, being able to frame your needs assessment that way is important. And thinking about that, because I think it helps to open up your way of thinking about the design, if you think about it this way, that it's not just defining those specs quite yet. So it's not necessarily saying, I need a particular kind of software or device that does X, Y, or Z. If you can kind of really understand what the problem is and the opportunity and what they're really trying to achieve, you actually may open up the space for novel ways of thinking about that. So, and why is it important? Really being able to clarify that story is important with that. There's more things with the project identification, like identifying the stakeholders. At this initial part, you may just have this at a very broad level, just very basic, not necessarily all that detailed. Because then what happens as we move into specification development, this is where we actually start to define those and become much more detailed related to that. So again, this really digs into the understanding the what. And it's easy to, sometimes with the specifications, to actually define how to do it. And there may be a couple of situations where that's necessary. But really, at this point, you're just still trying to understand what is needed. And so there's a variety of different things that we can do related to tasks and strategies to really start to understand why, or what is needed and why it is needed, but not necessarily yet how. So this is where we would really start to explore stakeholders, look at prior art, benchmark products, what is out there, what are the characteristics of those. And at the goal of the end of this is to make sure that we have measurable criteria, specifications at the end of this. So you may start out with something, I need it to be light, but then it needs to, at the end of this phase of the design process, it needs to weigh less than 5 pounds, or between 3 and 5 pounds, or some kind of measurable criteria for that. So one of the things that we ask is to describe the context. So we use this word. What do you mean by context and why is it important? Yes?
Situation that you're working in can change how you're able to do things. Like the GAPS team had to build a pedestal for a solar panel because they couldn't cut down the trees.
Yes. Right, so understanding, it's absolutely, because if you don't understand the context, because your design is going to go into some environment, right? Some location, some situation where there's people, there's ways of doing things. So if we're not aware of that context in which our project exists, absolutely it won't be successful. So, what are some more examples of things that might be context? Yes?
Not just necessarily the physical environment, but also the cultural environment. Like since in the GAPS team, we have to be careful of how we arrange the placement of the solar panels because in Medellin and where we're working, the greenery is very appreciated and they're very unwilling to remove it at times.
Right. So it really is important to understand the value placed on the trees and the greenery that are there related to that project. Anybody else? What are some other kind of broader context? Social issues, political issues that might be going on? Legal, regulatory kinds of environment? So, how about for schools? What are some broader context and issues that become really important to understand? Yes? Safe and simple? True. But what are teachers often really worried about? As far as what do school teachers have to be able to do in the classroom? What are they guided by? Huh? Lesson plans, state standards, right. Their lessons plans are to ensure that they're able to meet the state standards. So understanding that that's something really important to teachers is critical for those of you who are working on projects that are addressing educational needs, especially K through 12. Because if it's not meeting the state standards, it's not going to be of very much use to our community partner, all right? So there are other things related to that. When we talk about social context, there's really an important thing to understand what it is that your project partner is trying to achieve, what is their mission, and what are some particular issues that might be affecting the clients that they are working with. So aware of these kinds of things are important in understanding how it will inform, that they inform your design. Related to that. The other part is really understanding that organization. So what are governing bodies? How are things funded? In fact, something state funded versus privately funded. All of those things come into play when you think about it. So just being aware of those issues, any regulations that might affect. So when you think about stakeholders, let me go back. Well, we can do this. One way to identify all of the stakeholders of your project is to look at the overall system and see how various entities might interact with it. So if we take a look at this, so this is some ticket system that's used within a bank. Who are some of the stakeholders? If we look at this, huh? The customers, absolutely. But who else do we need to worry about? The people at the bank, right? How are they going to actually interact with this? So they're a stakeholder in this system as well. People that are doing the scheduling. I just pulled this diagram because I thought it was a cool way of looking at how people interact with the system. Who else might be some people that would be considered stakeholders in this? Yes?
The venue.
Huh?
The venue.
The venue? absolutely, yes. The performers, yep.
The sponsors of the venue?
The sponsors of the venue, yes, absolutely. Who else? And it may be there's developers, but we often forget about the people who have to maintain or the administrators of certain kind of systems. So you can look at what you are developing and see how are people interacting with this, and am I considering their needs within it. I had a team develop, it was a table for kids with disabilities, preschool age level, and they had this cool interactive table. But they kind of forgot about the teacher, and they had to have some batteries to be replaced. And in order to change the batteries, the teacher had to like get down underneath the table to change the batteries. So they had really thought about the kids really well, but had forgotten about the people that had to maintain it in that design. So thinking about all of those things that you need to do to interact. There certainly have been design situations where you're maybe given a constraint where actually the maintenance is absolutely critical to your project. And you can say, how can I maintain this project with the least amount of tools to be able to do it? So the other thing that we can do with stakeholders and doing a stakeholder analysis is understand how each of them are involved. What is their importance to it? What is the power that they have? And how will we involve them in our, as we develop our design? So you can actually just do a very simple kind of chart that identifies each of those stakeholders to see what their interest is and have a plan for engaging them. So it might be a monthly email just to update them what's going on. That might be, how you interact with maybe the director of something that you're doing. But if you really want to find out how the kids are responding to it, are you going to do something different? Yeah, so you're going to have a different plan for them. Their needs are going to be very important, but then you're probably going to engage them differently. So even though we have broad stakeholders, how we engage our different stakeholders depends on their relationship to our project. So just thinking through and making sure that you're keeping all your stakeholders involved appropriately is just a good exercise to go through. If you can't find that for your project, you should create it ongoing now. So there's a lot of different ways to gather some of that information from all of our different stakeholders. So if we really want to understand what that need is and what the perspective is of our different stakeholders, we can use interviews, observations, focus groups. We can create personas, scenarios. A lot of these things are different strategies that are used, and I'll show you a few of them. I'll actually discuss each one of those, but this is kind of a summary of the different ways. Often we place a lot of emphasis on the formal interview, and it can actually be valuable. But I would really challenge you to think about observation and really spending the time to see how it really works. Because I think a lot of times people don't realize things that they're doing or accommodations that they're already making for the design. So just observing your users, both related to the project but even more broadly, is actually really, really critical. And that came through again, from the Camp Riley class, where we actually spent that week with the campers. Watch them eat, watch them interact, watch them navigate the accessible trails at Bradford Woods. It informed our design tremendously. So just spending that time is really important. There's some resources on the website, on SharePoint, that you can use to try and actually plan for observations and interviews. One thing I wanted to show you here, for the use the methods from Stanford, I know that I've referenced this a couple of times. So if you look at the use our methods, they have different one-page PDFs for looking at this. So one thing to do is to look at their interview preparation. So it's just a one page on what you need to think about prior to your interview. And then these are great suggestions for how to interview and how to create questions that are going to elicit the most information. So instead of just saying, do you want this to be red or blue, you really want to start to ask. And I don't know, for those of you who did do the wallet exercise, having people describe what it was like their day provided a lot more insight than asking very specific questions about necessarily, do you want one thing or another? You really want to avoid binary questions that either have a yes or no or only have one answer. So you're really trying to get to the stories that you're trying to get from your stakeholders to really understand, to provide that extra insight related to that. So these are just some great resources that you can use when you're planning, and they have some others for other parts of the design process that you can look at. IDEO also has a whole design toolkit. This is actually really great for some of the global teams, because they really start to get at some of the cultural aspects as well related to that. So recommend that as a resource. So personas, how many people are familiar with personas? So we have real users, but sometimes it is good to create a persona to capture kind of the essential elements that we need to keep in mind as we're designing. So you can go back to think, what would because especially if you are designing for a broad set of users versus one specific person, you probably want to consider doing a persona to capture those essential elements. Because then you can test your design against, what would my persona want related to this? And does it fit into their life? It's one way to kind of ground and still design from that perspective of your user with this. So an example of how to do this, and it's fictional, and it's a generalization of what you've done, what you've learned. You can take that information, maybe you've interviewed 10 users, potential users. You can actually then create this persona. So the example I want to do is actually for the HERD device that we have some people working on this semester. So actually the team, when they first started out, this project was a little bit more speculative. Like, we knew there was a need, but we really wanted to understand the space that this project could fill. So communication devices are very expensive, and there's a wide range, like some communication devices go up to $10,000. So we were looking to fill, and if you've ever looked at a catalog for kids that have things for special needs, even a very simple button that plays a sound could be $50 or $100. So we knew that there was a space that we could fill related to this, but we weren't sure exactly how this would work. So the team spent a lot of time developing personas and scenarios, and then went out to stakeholders and could test those scenarios and stakeholders, the personas, to make sure that they actually would be realistic and it would work that way. So let me show you. So this device in particular was helping kids with severe communication disorders to be able to to communicate. So I don't know if I've shared, so I have triplets that are now 21, almost 22, but one of my children has severe autism. And he was diagnosed when they were like 2 years old. And he couldn't talk at all. He didn't understand the power of communication at all. So he was really frustrated because if he wanted juice, he didn't know how to say juice. My other two were asking for juice. But Matthew didn't know how to do that. So one of the ways he learned to communicate was to actually hand us a card. And that was symbolizing or his communication act to say, I want juice. So when he handed us the card for juice, that allowed us to be able to know that we could acknowledge that. And then he started to understand, I can actually ask for things that I want or need, and somebody will help me with that. Because initially he didn't understand that at all. This device wanted to build on that, so we knew we wanted to build on this basic handing the card system, but we wanted it to be able to communicate. Because if we hand somebody a card, first of all, may not know what it's asking. Second of all, hearing that sound actually helped him to learn to be able to talk when he could hear that. So we knew we wanted a device that fit in there, but we didn't know exactly how it would work. So we started to identify primary users of this and then secondary users, and started to realize there's somebody who's going to have to program this device or get it to be able to communicate what we want, because we wanted it customizable, and started to look at that. We identified user profiles of a teacher and a typical student that might use this, and really just started to identify characteristics of them. Then we wrote that persona of the teacher to help us keep in mind who might use this device, what they would want, and how it would fit into the broader context related to this. We had one for the student, and really talked about some broader things too, related to, for example, their gross motor capability, because that actually affects their ability to interact with the device. So really understanding what kind of student we were targeting this for. And then this is the really key part, coming up with that scenario then on how these different personas or people, stakeholders, would interact. And this defines how the device needs to work, as far as how are people going to interact with it. It necessitates having certain programming options or interfaces with the device. And it also indicates that we need certain feedback. So we use these personas, took them to speech-language pathologists, specialists in augmentative and alternative communication, and they said, initially this didn't work, that won't work. And we iterated on these until we got a scenario and personas that actually would be effective or realistic. So if you don't have these, and it depends on your project, I think these are things important to capture. Because I've heard even already stories that you have told about your community partners. So how are you capturing that? You can use personas or you can maybe use something else, but it's really important that future teams understand what you are learning about your community partner. Yes?
So we should take our example scenarios to some experts that we could talk to, or should we try out the example scenarios on site first, among our team?
Well, I'm not sure which one's the appropriate one for that, but you can try and do them with different things. So for us, the appropriate people to test our scenarios with were with the experts, who do alternative and augmentative communication all the time, because they could see how people would really interact, or would that be feasible. So maybe one or both of those different, being able to check that out. Okay? To some degree, sometimes this can lead to writing your user manual first, which seems crazy, but actually it's a really effective way to make sure that you're thinking about how your user is going to interact with it. So you can actually be thinking about exactly how somebody's going to interact, because then you'll remember, oh yeah, I need a switch, or I need a feedback indicator light for something. Another way that you can learn is role playing. And so there are things, common strategies. You can tape buttons to fingers to simulate arthritis. You can use a wheelchair around campus to understand what it's like to navigate. You can, not use one of your arms in trying to do a task, or limit your vision to be able to do that. So you can kind of actually do that. It can even be as simple, that really suggests a lot of people with disability, but even if you think about how would a kid interact with this device. So one of the things that's sitting over in the EPICS lab, one of the projects, it actually, and it was a picture on our website at one point, is you see these kids pointing to these LEDs in this display that we had delivered to the museum. The problem was the team designed it for the height of an adult and not the height of a kid. So even if they had gotten down on their knees to try and interact with the project, it would have provided insight on what this is going to look like. So if you're designing for kids or a museum, what is it going to be like if they are observing it at their height or within their reach? So those are things, so it's not even thinking about, oh, we have to think about people with disabilities. It's even, what is my typical user? How are they going to experience this? So going through your project as they would do it. I do want to caution, pretending to have one doesn't always, it provides insight, but you really want to defer to your real users to really understand what it's like, because there are other aspects to take into consideration. Prototype. I think you've heard me talk about this quite a bit, but it really is, and it can be for software. You're doing storyboards or other things to be able to do that. Any kind of CAD model, sketch, anything that you can do that is visual and or that they can interact with it is huge. And even if you're doing partial prototypes, often we think we have to get it to the end. That is not what the goal of the prototype is. It should be eliciting that information, thinking about what you were able to do for those who did the wallet exercise in 7 minutes, and how you can leverage that information to be effective. One of the mottos of IDEO and a lot of design firms is to fail quickly and cheaply. If your design's not going to work, you want to find out sooner than later, because usually a bad idea is just not going to survive. But you'd rather find out sooner or later in using prototypes. So one of the things that the company had done, and they write about this in some articles, that they were working with the company to design a new instrument to be able to do nasal surgery. And traditionally, the instruments had actually been linear, just not shaped as a handle like that. And they observed the surgeons, then the doctors performing this, and realized and saw them kind of doing this with the device. So they proposed, after the company had spent thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars, this prototype to them. And that was enough to be able to actually move forward with the surgeons. So they could give it to the surgeons and say, how would this work? They could hold it, and then they could continue the development. So this was the product that they showed in the development process. They've also done, there's some great TED Talks on design. So if you like design, TED Talks are great, and really talked about, one time they wanted to show the patient experience. So the way that they communicated the patient experience was actually giving a video of what it's like to be a patient in a hospital. And what do you think the video looked like? What usually happens if you're a patient in a hospital? Laying on a bed, right? It was like 10 minutes of the ceiling. So it actually made them think about the patient experience in a whole different way. So if you can videotape, what is it like to use this? If I'm going through or using this, what would the perspective be of my user? So you can do that as well. This was the feedback matrix for the prototype from the wallet exercise. It's also on the D-School Use Our Methods. This is a great way to actually elicit and capture the feedback of the prototype, because you want to know what worked, what can be improved, what things they liked, and what things, new ideas you had as a result. So prototypes are meant to elicit new ideas and refine an iteration on that. So this is a good way to capture that. As you start to capture all of those needs, understanding that context, understanding how they're going to do that, the end result of the specification phase is actually having measurable, specific design specs. You should be able to test them, and one of the things to do it even at this point is to start to understand, how am I going to know whether or not I've achieved the specification? It might be you actually have to design something into your product to actually measure something if it's really important. So knowing that ahead of time is actually really important for your specs. A lot of times we think of functional specs, and those are important. There may be physical, environmental kinds of things that it needs to, space, it needs to be within a certain footprint, all of those different things. Some of the aspects that you guys identified for gaps is that it can't allow to, you can't need to not cut down trees. So need to be able to retain the trees. Economic, legal, ADA, other kinds of things that you need to comply with. So these are a broad ways of evaluation criteria that if you think about specifications, identifying criteria in each of these areas is important. So to give you an example, kind of another project. So this was the predecessor for the HERD device. And what happened is there's a device on the market, and I think it's, $300 or $400 basically, where it has 4 cards, and you put these 4 cards in like the slots, similar to this. And when you pull one out, it says the sound. However, those devices, you have to remember what you recorded in slot 1 and make sure you line up the card. So you have to remember I recorded banana for slot 1, and apple for slot 2, and so on. Well, one of the things is that first of all, you have, when you're working with a class, it's hard to remember and keep all of that straight necessarily. And if you have different kids and you're changing it, to remember how it might be. So we wanted something that, so if we switch the cards around, that it would play the appropriate sound no matter what. So that was the design challenge. That was the need we were trying to address that wasn't available in the market at all. And one of the real reasons why this is so important, and I've seen it with my son, once you learn something, so it's really hard to learn something, but if my son learns something wrong, it's really, really, really hard to undo that. So more than probably a lot of learners, making a mistake here has a lot of, it's just really a challenge, has a lot of negative impact. So one of the things we wanted to make sure is that we were really reliable, and that this would actually allow us and allow teachers to be more effective where they weren't accidentally teaching the wrong thing related to that. So they wanted to be able to have up to 15 cards that could be programmed. We could put them at different places in these slots, and so you could either put it in and it would make the sound, or take it out and it would make the sound, or whatever corresponding message went along with it. And so this really was something that was, to help with communication. So to start to understand what this need was, then we started to identify how many messages we needed, how long was the average message, this started to, the number of cards we wanted to identify. This was our initial thing that we started to look at. We needed to record and store sounds. But then as we got going along, we could start to then identify specific things that would then actually indicate like how much memory we needed for the device and things like that. Another key in developing specification is looking at benchmark products. So one of the ways that we got that we wanted to have 4 cards, well, the things on the market at least had 4 cards or up to 4. And so that was a benchmark specification that would allow us to be able to do that as well. The other thing is, we don't want to violate, infringe on anybody else's IP or patents with that. And it may actually identify IP opportunities, intellectual property opportunities for you as well. So really why this can help understand that gap. What do current products offer, and what is the space that we can fill with this? So recommend organizing your specs in a table. And in addition to identifying what it is, where you got it from. Because sometimes things change. Sometimes we design things because one person wanted it a certain way, and then they leave the organization, and that requirement actually goes away. So understanding that, or technology changes, and so, or regulations change. And so understanding that is actually really important. How will you know how you achieved it? So again, that's how do you test related to this, and then whether or not you actually completed it. Recommend using this kind of thing in, actually your homework is going to be, can you identify your specifications for your current project, or how will you be able to identify those if you haven't done that? This should be the basis of like your design reviews. Your design reviewers will want to know what your specs are, because they're not going to be able to give you good feedback if they don't know what you're trying to do. So this is a summary of what you're trying to do with your design related to that. Okay, this is one example. I have 2, just if you hold on one second, I just have 2 more slides related to specs, and then we'll do conceptual design next time. So you can start to do this and start to get more specific. Another example, and these are more function based on a Mars rover, functional specifications, but you can start to see that they're specific in what they're requiring and detailed related to the design. Okay, so your homework for next week, list your project specifications. Okay, now maybe you're in detailed design, but you don't know where your project specifications are. You need to go find out where they are, or go back and revisit and become more detailed with that. If you have a new project where you're not quite here yet, what strategies will you use? How can you what will you do to actually define those? So that's your homework related to that. Okay. For attendance on the Scantron, you just need to put your name, Purdue ID, and true for number 1. All right? Shankar is in the back, or I can collect your Scantrons. Have a great week.